So we're going to do something a little different. We're going to turn to the audience and maybe see if we can prompt you to start with some questions rather than ending with some questions. So if there's anything, we're looking at the specifics of the future of digital therapeutics. Before we do that, I'm going to just take a personal privilege and introduce my partner, Mark Weeks, who's here in the audience with us today. Go ahead and stand up, Mark. Mark is one of the really preeminent venture and digital health attorneys in the Bay Area, and so has come to be part of the meeting today. But that said, just if I could prompt any questions that you'd like to sort of, sure. I'm not saying we're going to answer them all right now. We just want to kind of know what's on your mind. But go ahead.
No, I'd love to hear you answer the question that Jazz and I were asked later in the panel, and that is, do you think the life sciences industry can disrupt itself from the inside, or do you think it's going to take something else much different?
Great question. Okay.
Any other ones?
Any other questions that we should be thinking about?
Focus the thinking of the panel. Well, that's a good one to start.
Okay, so that's a great start. Okay, so why don't we just take a quick moment to say, what have you been doing lately and what are you seeing?
So I'll just start, so my biggest passion is actually trying to move the patient centricity and, kind of, customer focus to the life sciences and healthcare as well. Today, most of the companies run as a product-driven company, so we don't really necessarily look at, what is the patient angle in the whole picture and what is the bigger story about that. That's kind of a top of my mind. The other thing is, I strongly believe, I know that, previous panelists talked about it, of the patient-generated, kind of health data as well. And we see a huge number. I think this year was like 150 million, different smartwatches and kind of wearables that were sold. We're going to generate about, 3,000 exabytes of data in 2020, and it's untapped potential there, and I strongly believe, there is an opportunity for us to have a data-driven decisions. The other, I spent, a fair share of my life as well in search, and I didn't mention, but I was co-founder for startups, and then seeing the whole life cycle through the valley from, as I said, internet to the rest of it, and seeing the impact and potential that the digital health can have on the pretty, I will say, traditional industry is phenomenal. Today, I think if I look back 3 to 5 years, digital health really didn't deliver up to my expectations, just be honest. But I see it as an opportunity right now, and it's a right timing for us to go ahead and use that and build the momentum and build the services. I think previous panelists mentioned as well that the concept of the services. Look at the Apple announcement, a few weeks back. It was all about products. It's all about building an iPhone and platform to deliver. What was the last announcement about? It was all about building the services. So I had a bunch of friends at Apple that they work in the supply chain. I said, you guys are rendered obsolete right now. Look at Tesla as well. Tesla, what do you guys believe? Is Tesla, a car manufacturing company or is it a software development company? Look at that tablet, and I basically on my Tesla, we get updates, overnight updates, increased my mileage, The interface, if you compare the interface when they first came out with the interface that looks like today, it's completely different. So having a power and opportunity to do something like that and try to translate in healthcare, that gets me up in the morning and excited.
Thank you. Euan.
Yeah, so actually I'm going to describe what I've been doing, and I'm going to answer your question, I think, at the end there, because I've got kind of an example of it, I think. So I was approached by J&J Medical Devices about 3 years ago and asked, they said that at the time, we've got this pretty traditional portfolio. It's an incredibly large portfolio. Medical devices, just so you know, J&J is about a $27 billion business. But mostly it's hardware. It's implants, knee replacements, hip replacements. Orthopedics is about half of that business. Then it's surgical instrumentation, everything from sutures to potentially in the future robots. So they saw these sort of digital capabilities growing amongst competitive companies and really wanted to figure out what that should mean for J&J. So I went inside, and actually, and again, I should say, it was a risk as far as I was concerned, because you hear a lot about digital transformation and companies want to transform themselves digitally. And to me, it's like, you ask almost anybody and they'll say they want to lose weight, but actually very few people do. So digital transformation is similar to me as that. Anyway, so from the inside, I actually started in orthopedics, and at the face of it, the most traditional of traditional medical device industries, orthopedics. And it's been a really interesting journey because I asked some fairly fundamental questions, which I could coming in from the outside, such as like, how do you characterize success for orthopedics? So if you want to use digital technologies to drive success, what does success look like? And they would say to me, well, we have very successful products. We have less than 1% failure rate. And I said, well, that's not success, that's not failure. And there's a difference. I mean, how do you actually define success? And really, there were a lot of blank stares, and people honestly just couldn't answer it. So I stood back from it, and I thought, well, what is success for orthopedics? And success for orthopedics is really mobility for patients. And when you ask a patient what they want from in terms of success from, say, a knee replacement, they will actually say that. They'll say mobility. Furthermore, when you ask them after an event if the procedure has been successful, generally they'll have a very, very different answer from the surgeon who performed the procedure. The surgeon's answer will be to throw up a radiograph and say, yeah, look at that, perfect bone fusion with the implant, no tibial loosening. We've got a very, very good firm implant in place, complete success. You ask a patient, the same patient, whether it's successful, and they'll say, no, it's horrible, I can't get out of a chair. I thought I'd be running around in the backyard with my grandkids. Instead of that, I'm still in pain, I'm still in discomfort, it's a different form of pain and discomfort, but I'd say, no, it hasn't been successful. And there's a very high level of dissatisfaction amongst orthopedic patients. In some cases up to sort of 20% dissatisfaction. So there's an area there to focus on, which is success. And that became, for me, the guiding force in putting together the digital strategy. Because one thing we can measure, and the example came out earlier on, one thing you can measure now with digital technologies is mobility. And it wasn't really possible before, but you can now, with digital tech, get inside somebody's life and start to think about, was this procedure really a success? And that came to me as building these 3 pillars that I talk about now, and you'll hear Alex Gorski talking the same language, which is gratifying. Engaging across the continuum of care. And instead of thinking robotics, for example, as the company goes into robotics, thinking about digital surgery. And what that actually means is there are 3 main influencers of success for a surgical procedure. The first is actually the patient themselves. Well, I'd say the first is the device and the technology that's used, where J&J has been focused up till now. The second, I'd say, is the patient. And that's patient selection, patient preparedness, engagement of the patient in their own rehabilitation after the surgery, and tracking and monitoring them and helping them through that rehab can actually have a big impact. And the third is surgical skills. And we tend to ignore that generally in surgery. Surgery, in any case, is usually a checkbox. You're analyzing whether a procedure has been successful, whether a medical management strategy has been successful, and you'll say, did they have surgery? And you'll say, check. Well, the reality is there are differences between surgical skills and surgical capability. Surgery is very, very complex. And I always say, 50% of surgeons are below average. And I can prove that mathematically if anybody wants me to put it on a whiteboard. But the reality is, 50% of this room is below average. Now, if I asked you to stick up your hands and say, are you in the bottom 50%, nobody would put their hands up. Well, I might, yeah, and you might, yes, as well. But none of us, most people wouldn't. And it's the same as surgeons, right? They don't realize necessarily they're doing what they believe to be is right for every single patient. They don't necessarily know that they're fine-tuning. There are different ways of doing it which can actually up the scale of their performance. So the strategy has been to put together a full range of digital solutions, patient monitoring, sort of prehab, rehab, surgical skills, both from the surgeon and the team, software to monitor the team through the procedure to make sure they're always doing the same thing every day, which is a big milestone for success in surgery. And then as we moved into robotics, to make sure we think about robots as a two-way data flow. There's something which enables the surgeon to maybe improve their manual dexterity, but they also track every single motion the surgeon makes. And everything feeding into a single data platform. So finally, we'll be able to look at success, less successful procedures, and be able to use machine learning to trace back and say, the surgery really made a difference, and it was this skill inside the surgical procedure that really had an impact on patients. Or it was the patient behavior. It was nothing to do with the surgeon. It wasn't this particular hip implant they used. It was the way in which it was put in. or the way in which the patient engaged in rehab that actually made a difference. And that's never really been possible before. And that's true disruption. So a very, very long answer to your question. I actually think, for the most part, the disruption needs to take place from inside the industry, because having dealt with single-point solutions as startups, all the way to very, very large companies and tech companies as well, I would say the most disruptive strategies are those where the large companies recognize that they do have the scale to engage across the continuum of care, and they engage in having that impact. But lastly, it doesn't mean they have to do it by themselves. What it really means is you need an ecosystem. They need to engage in an ecosystem play. J&J doesn't have wearables. It doesn't have sensors. Sure, they can develop them, but as you pointed out earlier on, that's just not productive. They can leverage them, they can buy partnerships, they can do what they need to do. So the disruption, I think, needs to be driven from the inside, but it will take an ecosystem to do it.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about what I'm focused on right now, but I'm going to go to the audience question first. I think there's one thing that our pharma and medtech and other incumbent companies have to make sure they have the answer to. What is your biggest fear? If you can't identify that, you have no chance of disrupting yourself. If you were Blockbuster back in the day, it wasn't, oh, my fear is someone's going to come in with like a disruptive internet model. It was, what if people stop coming to my store because I built my model around beginning to sell them some popcorn and some candy and then charging them late fees but it was about coming to the store. And Netflix obviously said, well, I'm going to disrupt that way. Then Netflix may have said to themselves, my greatest fear is people will stop using DVD players because that's my entire business. Fortunately, they probably figured that out and then disrupted themselves. And it sounds easy in hindsight, but back when they were investing a lot of money, there was no bandwidth for it. So a lot of shareholders were going, come on, are you losing money here? Will that really play out? So it's easy in hindsight. So number one, what is your biggest fear? And then work that problem. Number two, I think there's two examples that come to my mind of where companies have successfully transitioned. One of the very well-known ones is IBM going from a widget maker and moving into a service model and being one of the dominant players in the widget field and now a dominant player in the service field. And okay, if you break that down, what happened? Number one, they got a CEO who came from a service background. He was head of American Express and had some other services in his background. So if you want to become something, it probably needs to start at the top, and probably not just one person, but several. They were a huge company, well over 100,000 people back then, and if you try and home grow within your four walls, not only will you squash it, but let's say you don't squash it and it's growing really well, you're not going to move the needle very quickly. So they went out and acquired service companies with tens of thousands of people. So now you're truly impacting your company in a way that you cannot ignore, that your people realize because you put your money behind it, that you must be serious about making this transition. So I love that use case. Another one that I live and explain briefly. So BCG, we're a 55-year-old consulting firm, and we've had a model that's been very traditional and worked very well for us. We believed that our client needs were changing and we needed to evolve. And you can see 5 years after we began to make some of those decisions, it looks kind of obvious and cool. We have 1,000 people doing digital, and they're actually really well integrated into our core business, and our teams work very well together. But how did we start that? We started with 30 people on a beach that we acquired. And we left them alone, and we provided them capital and rope to go and grow the business as they saw fit. And as they grew, we began to slowly find, and there was a lot of friction along the way, ways to begin to integrate. And now it's probably 10% of our company, and that's truly moved the needle, and it's one of our fastest growth engines. So to me, it's got to probably be outside with a lot of blessing and then mindful of bringing it in, or big acquisitions that change things. It's just my 2 cents.
I didn't have a chance to answer the question, so I strongly believe we have a right actually to interrupt from inside. I strongly believe that. I was one of the early people in the BCG, and the whole process, the digital ventures, the whole premise was trying to leverage the unfair advantage that actually the large companies have. I've been in startups, and I always say, like, I started from zero. I had 0 customers on a platform. When we actually built a business with Starbucks, we had 15 million people on platforms from day one. That's significant difference there. So I strongly believe that we have a right to do that. The key question there is to how flexible we are to be able to bring the talent that actually knows how to do that from outside. And Carl did an amazing job at Flex over there, to basically go ahead and convince the Flex to do something like that. And I remember our early conversation, back last year when I asked Carl, okay, how many people did you recruit from Flex? And if I remember correctly, he said basically 1. But you said at the same time, if you asked me that, you said if you asked me that week ago, there'll be 1. But now that's 0 because she left as well. So I mean, it was just. That's what we need to understand. That, it's not necessarily, you can pick up, there's smart people, you can pick up and train people and bring them over, but the mindset and culture shift needs to happen. What I've seen in large companies, as well, working at BCG, and we have these silos of functional kind of groups, and it just doesn't work, if you want to disrupt or really innovate anything. And that's, the BCG DV model was built, not the only one, there's a ton of them outside, of the BCG Digital Ventures, is building these cross-functional teams. They own the problem end to end. So trying to basically go ahead and make sure that, and that's what actually modern workforce expects as well. You're not going to be able to hire, I always say, like, I can go hire people that are, they want to own their piece, whatever it is, but that's not the people that I want to hire. I want to go ahead and hire people that have ownership end to end. They care about the product, they care about scaling the product, and they behave like that's my product. It's not necessarily, part of the company that I work with, that's the part of my product. So that's what we try actually to bring the talent in Boston Scientific to execute.
We have another question.
Thanks. Do you want to build on your guys' this is on?
Yes.
Thanks. Want to build on your guys' comments and Diana's question. So I've had this belief for a number of years that I want you to refute or support or give your view on, which is the biggest way to drive this internal change and internal disruption to me, the obvious one is at the level of the board of directors and the CEO to say, we spend X billions of dollars a year on R&D. And starting tomorrow, I'm making it up, 2 of my $5 billion are going to go to only digital programs, meaning I'm not going to invent new diabetes drugs. I'm going to put $2 billion into driving adherence through technology, as an example. Just curious do you think that's a good idea or not? And 2, do you, in the companies you guys are working with, you don't have to name the company, but do you even see a potential for that kind of debate even happening at the level of the board, call it in the next 3 years?
So I'll jump in and start with that. So I think Don Jones is probably the most qualified person to answer that. And if you're with us, Don, I don't know if you still are. I know you're going in and out. But every major pharmaceutical company today has a C-level digital health initiative. Whether they've gone so far as to take the step of a percentage of R&D spend is a provocative way to raise it in the board. But I would just call that out as that it is definitely here and in a very prominent way. But any other?
I'll just say from my perspective, look at my company. The fundamental shift. Looking at the traditional med device company and kind of changing that to the med tech company as well. So that's a big mind shift. And then in my mind, it's path going forward. Going to the board of directors and asking for that, I think we have to go ahead and grow to that point. My concept and idea is like we have to. I come from startup role, so you have to be scrappy. You have to put some points on the board. You have to see it provide the value. You have to show the traction, and then you have right to basically go ahead and ask for that. So it's just going out bluntly and saying, look what's happening in the world. In my mind, it's not going to cut it.
And I think they have to do it, but there's really good playbooks for doing it, and so that's the good news. So one is you have to prepare your shareholders for that shift. If you followed like Tim Cook, he's been working for many years to get his shareholders adjusted that we are going to be investing in services, and eventually you'll see the revenue. And a good CEO knows how to put that pace together externally and internally. We see ResMed in the med tech sector has done a really good job of managing their shareholders of how we're going to go from widgets to we're going to be making very large acquisitions. We just saw Propeller, but they've done, I think, $800 million size acquisitions, which is pretty big for their company in software as a service. So yes, they have to, it starts with the CEO agreeing with himself that I need to begin to manage Wall Street and then internally. And when you do it, it does make the statement that I was kind of making the point earlier, and you begin to make a burning platform when, if you make an acquisition, you have to do something to fulfill what you've spent on.
Yeah, so sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the world I've been living in for the last sort of 3 years, and I'd say it has to happen like that. But I can say from having lived inside it and during the phase of that change, it creates a lot of pain and a lot of friction. And even if, at the top, the decision is made to do that, the further down you go in the organization, it builds a lot of resentment because you've got people that are really, it's like changing the wheels of the bus while the bus is moving, because the company needs to deliver to its shareholders based on the products that it's got today. And yet the promise of digital is sometime in the future, if at all, and it's very often it's an enabler of new business models for the same products as opposed to generating revenue in its own right. And that causes friction, sort of, they said, all the way down through the organization, starting with the sales force, who are clamoring for the next generation of a product that the company already makes and already sells, and can't understand why R&D dollars are not being applied to that. They're being applied to something new, which is out there, and their customers aren't even asking for at the moment. So there's a lot of friction as you go through that process. But I do think it's happening. It's clear. I think a lot of validation in this room. And I can tell you, I'm actually leaving J&J at the end of June, and sort of in the process of sort of engaging with other people to figure out what I'm going to do next. And there are a lot of companies out there going through that same process who want the same thing to happen as I've just been through at J&J, and they're doing it in the same way. We're willing to invest. We're going to do it. We've got to bite the bullet because other people are doing it. We're seeing it happen. We just need to know how.
If you wanted to cheat and actually have your cake and eat it too, and not have to do that, I think you would have to look at your mindset differently. So take an hourglass, put it horizontal, and the middle of it is your commercial launch point. So we have commercial over here and we have R&D over here. This is the funnel that a lot of your companies have. This is the $1 billion. It's risk. It always cracks me up when they're like, "Oh, Google just throws them around money and risk." Do you have any idea what your risk is over here? It's probably much higher. You asked, should we shift some of that? Maybe we don't need to, because digital health is the R&D dollars relatively are much smaller, but then the commercial spend may be just as big as anything else we have. But it might be so synergistic to our business, if we at least start there, that we can accomplish our current commercial goals and use the same dollars. We may need to hire different people, but it might be the same absolute spend. So I think there is a possibility.
Yeah, I
I
think I get where you're coming from. I mean, that's a great theory. I think the reality of it is, I didn't mean to say it like that. The reality is that there is
consulting.
I know, like that doesn't show. I'm just kidding. So, I mean, the reality is that this friction sort of exists inside the organization, and it's not just. I think if you see it just from an R&D spend standpoint, then I think you're probably right. In fact, I know you're right. I completely agree with you. But what you're talking about is transforming a business, which generally means transforming a business model. If you're going to market, and I call these sort of digital wraparounds, if you're going with it, whether that's a wraparound of a drug or a device, very often digital transformation needs to wrap this new service or whatever around the product. That's a new way of going to market, which the sales force themselves are not familiar with. And it involves different revenue streams, different types of contract, which is fully disruptive to the entire organization. It's not just to the R&D dollars. So I think, on absolutely you're right. I think you can do it. You can transition in terms of R&D spend. But I think there's a worry that companies go into this thinking that's all they have to do. It's not. There's a lot more than that.
Yeah,
I'm just going to stop you for 1 second, if I may.
No worries.
So I'm going to try and, in our closing minutes, just segue back to one of the central themes that we tried to establish as we put the panel together. But I'm going to quickly answer Diana's question from my vantage point. I think Euan is fundamentally correct that the change will come from within. But I would say if you look at it, the change has not come from one of the expected areas. If you look at the tech companies, Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, huge investments, but they have not shifted the needle, I don't believe, in healthcare in any meaningful way. But Eric Topol would say the change is going to come from the patient, so we'll yet to see that. But just to go back to the panel theme, what we're really going to focus on is the best practices for shifting to digital therapy. And given that BrightInsight is the focal point that has brought us all together, I'd like to maybe end a little bit on that note with some thoughts. So if we talk about the challenges to pharma that is presented in moving into digital arenas, and I'll credit Cal for these thoughts. One is obviously cloud infrastructure increases compliance risk. Second, there's a regulatory construct that is forcing heavy investment in compliance. Cybersecurity has been talked about and is ubiquitous. Global privacy laws are likewise ubiquitous. And then there's the whole notion that we've been talking about of change within. So if you look at what the BrightInsight product is focused on, is it's really, I think, intended to be a force multiplier. It's intended to pull the major problems that are faced at the core or network effect. Those are probably two similar images. And so what I'd like to challenge as we close the panel is a little discussion of, do we think this effort is the kind of effort that will really be the force multiplier of moving digital into pharma? And so I'm going to actually ask Chris to start, because I think you're spending a lot of time with the kinds of companies that are likely to be users of the platform. Just what are you seeing at this crossroads?
Something I've been very passionate about in the journey I talked about with my career was part of the invention of digital health type things, part of the proof that they could work and exist. But it's like building a locomotive and showing it can like go forward and backwards and carry something, but the train track's about 30 feet long. And so now we're at this moment in time where we actually need train tracks, and we need stations, and we need switches, and we need yards, and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that we need is a very reliable, large-scale, trusted platform for healthcare software and IoT devices. And that was completely missing in my mind. AWS did not offer that, and so BrightInsight came along. I'm a huge fan, or we wouldn't have invested our time to become partners. So that is an example to me of how what I would call scale enablers. And I think for the next 3 years, it's where we're going to see a lot of the investment and the news headlines. Just a couple other examples. We're ESI announcing that they're going to make a formulary for digital health. You cannot have at any scale without really new structures payments and adjudicated and transacted without going through some of the mainstream players. And that's a great example of how they're beginning to do that in a scaled way. We have not yet seen the Salesforce adaptability, so keep your eye on when does a pharma company hire different people at large scale. We don't really have a data broker. So everyone talks about monetizing the data, and when we work with people to build businesses, well, how are we going to monetize the data? We can come up with the theories, but you can't actually implement it. If you look at all other well-established industries that have data, financial services or media, there's very large data, but these are just middlemen. They don't exist yet in digital health. They completely do. IMS being a great example, right, in pharma. I can go on, but I'm keeping my eye on all these scale enablers. And to me, BrightInsight is an example of one, very important one, and why, to me, these are the turning points. We cannot scale yet, but we're getting close.
Okay, well, Euan, I'm going to let you bring us home, and I'm going to try and keep us on schedule too, Reed. But what are you thinking, Alex?
Sure, absolutely. So in my mind, in the current rate of innovation is like 3 to 5 years. How we drop that down to 6 months or more, how we support the iterating processes, how we actually go ahead and see the personalization or value-based care. We need to be able to have data to be able to make these decisions and make the process, make the therapies better, optimize the deliveries, and without the platforms like this, it's going to be difficult to do that. So, right now we sit in the office, as I said, 3 to 5 years. We try to build the best product that we think about without really having the insights from the end consumer about that. So having the platform to supply that information to us in real time, it's invaluable in my opinion.
Euan, force multiplier.
Oh yeah, I mean, I actually don't have a lot to add. I think it's been answered really well, not just here, but I think by Cal in his opening remarks. I think, fundamentally, when you look at digital transformation, the companies that need to transform are not expert in that one area. They know their own products. They don't know about data management. They don't know about, building that environment around the data where it can be used productively to generate insights. And to sort of ultimately produce algorithms that will change the trajectory of care. They're just not expert in that, and I think having a business that's focused on that, you don't expect for the company to understand its own legal issues. They would hire attorneys to do that for them, right? Why would you expect that in this particular space as well? Coupled with the fact that it does, as we've said several times now, it involves an ecosystem. No company is going to have the full range of solutions they need in order to complete that digital transformation. So having access to that, that sort of data management side of things in a healthcare environment and all the expertise that involves, I think together with, an ecosystem to tap into, I think that's just a great thing for large and small companies, and definitely that force multiplier, as you called it.
Great. So we're going to try and keep on schedule, maybe a chance for if there's one last question, and then we'll let each of our panelists wrap with final thoughts.
Sure, I'll say one more thing. Heidi Does with Google. There were some really great points that all of you made, specifically around when we think about the misaligned success outcome metrics. So the hospital ecosystem is looking at one set of success metrics, but the patient is looking at a completely different set. The advantage and benefit of where we're going with digital health is that we're now going to bridge that gap, and patients are going to be able to use data to have a common language, to have a better conversation with whether it's their physician, their payer, all of the different stakeholders in providing the care, and better asking for what they need to reach the success outcome of how do I get my life back, how do I enjoy the life I'm living, and that whole conversation will be much easier to have, and I think will be much more successful.
Great. And to have that coming from one of the leading tech companies, that's good stuff, so thank you. So why don't we wrap it? Alex, we'll maybe let you say any parting observations.
I'm a strong believer in digital health. I use this example all the time. I look at my mother. So I'm not going to tell the age that's not appropriate, and that's going to tell my age as well. So, but 30 years ago, she'll go to the doctor and she'll basically get whatever she needs to get. She'll take that as a Bible and follow that to the letter. In today's world, that's not the case anymore. What she's looking for to partner the physicians to figure out what is the optimal care for the condition that she's trying to actually go and get addressed. And I strongly believe that partnership and that collaboration, as you mentioned, and providing that implicit and explicit data in a mix to have an understanding the whole perspective is going to be the key for the success. A few years back, I actually spoke at a conference at a patient engagement as well. It was a company that was actually building the vacuum pumps for diabetic patients. And interesting, when they looked at some data and realized, what is the adherence of the patients, but they didn't really understand what is the life events that are happening around that patient as well. So, you have a grandma that has, basically the vacuum pump, but she has, grandkids visiting. She's not going to have that thing on. So you have to put that in perspective to be able to paint the right picture and understand, what is the right, treatment and how to address that.
Yeah, I use it as my wrap-up. I think it's an awesome comment, and it's I described how, and every digital play that I've done so far, and it's been a lot now at this point, I have started from that perspective, which is how do you define success from a patient standpoint, and that is the opportunity for digital. I described how I did it for orthopedics and how that built that sort of transformation model for orthopedics. First time I did it was actually at a live call, patient monitoring with an EKG. Went in there and I sort of basically said it's a team of sort of 30 engineers, and I said, down tools, you're all in marketing for the next 3 weeks. I want you to call every single patient who's bought this and understand their story. And that built the whole strategy around, well, they want to monitor their own EKGs because they don't know when they're in AFib. They want to know because it drives their behavior change. So we built the algorithm strategy and sort of got that through Well, Mike Reiter is here, who was very much responsible for bringing that through, now part of the BrightInsight team. But no, it starts with the patient every single time, and that's the big opportunity for digital. And I think if we forget that, we will not build successful strategies. We remember it, every single strategy will be successful.
I'd say, why are we playing defense? Shouldn't we be playing offense? Why do we sit around going, is Amazon going to disrupt us? Amazon is they're not coming to be mean to other industries. They're saying, oh, I have some assets. Where else can I apply them? Oh, I was already having a big server for my own business. I guess I could maybe sell that as a server to other people. And they came into IBM's territory. I'll give you an example. This is what we live for in the job that I have is what are the corporate assets that you have that you could apply somewhere else? And so one that Alex worked on a little bit too, Qantas Airlines in Australia is a huge market share leader, dominant. Their points are like currency there. And they said, well, how can we expand our business? We can't get any more market share in the airlines. We said, we give this great asset. And long story short, we created Qantas Assure, which is a health insurance company, and it became the #3 health insurance company very quickly in Australia, and it was built all around wellness and the point system, and we had Christopher Walken for Miles TV campaign, and that's an example of extending your assets. So what are the assets that we have in our healthcare companies, and maybe we should be in Hollywood. So what is it that we're missing?
Just to add on that, so on the Qantas side, so we talked about right to disrupt from inside. You talk about the airline company and the board of directors. I had the privilege actually to host the whole board of directors in Silicon Valley a few years back. What they care about is two things, safety and security. How you get these people to think outside the box and kind of do something like insurance business, and that's the power of Alan, who was the CEO over there, trying to convince, plus the partnership like we had with the BCG to push that envelope further.
Great note. So, well, thank you very much. Reed.